A neighborhood dictator experiences a very specific kind of terror when the clipboard finally drops. Untouchable, that's how Barbara saw herself, armed with HOA bylaws, designer sunglasses, and a board of cowed suburbanites. Glaring at Alexander, a holdout whose property predated her beige McMansions, she issued an ultimatum: surrender the house or pay $1 million. What she failed to realize was that this old man literally owned the ground beneath her feet, setting the stage for the greatest eviction in suburban history. Alexander Remington knelt in the dirt, his calloused fingers working a tomato seedling into the dark, loamy soil of his front yard. He didn't wear gardening gloves. He liked the feel of the earth. It grounded him. It reminded him of his father, a diesel mechanic who bought these 5 acres in 1968 with cash saved in coffee cans and oil-stained envelopes. Back then, the land was nothing but Georgia pine and wild blackberry bushes at the edge of the county line. Now it was a heavily wooded island, surrounded by a sea of relentless, suffocating beige. Oak Ridge Estates had sprouted up around Alexander 5 years ago. The developer, a faceless conglomerate called Suncrest Homes, had bought out the neighboring farms one by one. They came to Alexander last, offering a lowball figure for his 5 acres, assuming an older black man, living in a modest, cedar-shingled ranch house, would take the quick payout and quietly disappear. Alexander had politely declined. When they doubled the offer, he declined again. When they sent a slick lawyer in a sharp suit to explain how difficult life could get for a holdout, Alexander simply racked his 12-gauge shotgun loud enough to be heard through the screen door and told the man to get off his porch. Suncrest Homes built around him. They carved the earth bare, laid down acres of asphalt, and erected 200 identical homes with 0 lot lines, pristine Bermuda grass, and roofs the color of weak tea. They built a massive stone entrance gate, a luxury community pool, and a sprawling clubhouse. They called it exclusive. Alexander called it a prison. Alexander's property sat dead in the middle of it all, separated from the subdivision by a thick, wild tree line that he refused to trim. His gravel driveway intersected with their freshly paved Oak Ridge Boulevard. To the residents of Oak Ridge Estates, Alexander was an eyesore, a glitch in their perfect matrix. No one felt this more acutely than Barbara Carmichael. Barbara was the president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. She was a woman in her late 40s who treated the HOA bylaws with the kind of religious fervor usually reserved for holy texts. She drove a pristine white golf cart equipped with a flashing yellow light, patrolling the neighborhood with a clipboard and a permanently pursed mouth. She measured grass height with a literal ruler. She fined people for having the wrong shade of white curtains visible from the street. Barbara hated Alexander. She hated his cedar house. She hated his rusted 1978 Ford F-150 parked under a carport. Most of all, she hated that he was entirely immune to her authority. Alexander wasn't in the HOA. His deed predated the subdivision by decades. He had no covenant, no dues, and no obligation to conform. To Barbara's beige vision of the world, the trouble started on a Tuesday in early April. Alexander was on his porch, drinking his coffee black, watching a pair of blue jays fight over a peanut. The whine of an electric motor cut through the morning air. Barbara's golf cart stopped at the end of his driveway. She didn't get out. She just sat there, glaring at a patch of clover that had dared to creep near the property line. Alexander ignored her. He took a sip of his coffee. The next day, an envelope arrived in his mailbox. The return address bore the gold foil crest of the Oak Ridge Estates HOA. Inside was a formal citation. Violation: unkempt landscaping, weeds, overgrowth visible from Oak Ridge Boulevard. Fine, $50. Please remit payment to the HOA management office within 14 days. Alexander read it twice. He didn't laugh. He didn't get angry. He simply walked into his kitchen, struck a match, lit the corner of the heavy cardstock, and dropped it into the stainless steel sink. He watched it burn to ash, washed it down the drain, and went back to his tomatoes. He thought that would be the end of it. A clerical error. A power-tripping suburbanite testing the waters. He was wrong. Barbara wasn't testing the waters, she was declaring war. Over the next 3 months, the letters kept coming. $50 for an unauthorized paint color on his front door. It had been forest green since 1995. $100 for an unapproved outbuilding, the greenhouse his late wife had built. $200 for a nuisance vehicle, his functioning registered Ford. Alexander burned them all. He never replied. He never called the number on the letterhead. His silence infuriated Barbara more than any shouting match could have. To Barbara, a lack of compliance was a personal insult. A lack of acknowledgement was a declaration of supreme disrespect. She started telling the neighbors that Alexander was a squatter, and she hinted darkly at property values plummeting because of the element living in the center of their community. She began weaponizing city services. Animal control showed up because of an anonymous tip about a dangerous, aggressive dog. Alexander's dog, a 12-year-old golden retriever named Buster with severe arthritis, had barely managed to lift his head when the officer approached. The officer apologized and left. Code enforcement arrived a week later, citing a complaint about illegal dumping. They found nothing but well-maintained compost bins. The inspector, a tired guy named Ramirez, took one look at Alexander's pristine garden and sighed. "Just keep your head down, Mr. Remington. The lady in the golf cart has the mayor's ear." Alexander leaned on his hoe, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I've been here since before she was born, son. I ain't going anywhere." But Barbara was done playing with city bureaucracies. If the city wouldn't remove Alexander, she would. The air in Oak Ridge Estates felt thick and humid the afternoon. Barbara finally crossed the line. It was late July. The heat radiating off the neighborhood's blacktop was oppressive, but beneath the canopy of Alexander's ancient oaks, it was 10 degrees cooler. He was sitting on a lawn chair, fixing the carburetor on his lawnmower, grease staining his fingertips. The crunch of tires on gravel made him look up. It wasn't the golf cart this time. It was Barbara's silver Mercedes SUV. She drove it right past his property line, kicking up dust, and parked aggressively close to his carport. Barbara stepped out. She wore a crisp tennis skirt, a pink polo shirt, and oversized sunglasses that hid half her face. She carried a thick manila folder. Behind her, in the passenger seat, sat a man Alexander recognized as Richard, the HOA's vice president, a quiet, balding man who always looked like he was suffering from mild indigestion. Richard didn't get out of the car. Alexander didn't stand up. He kept a rag in his hands, slowly wiping the grease from his knuckles. "Mr. Remington," Barbara said. Her voice was sharp, carrying the practiced, nasal tone of a woman who had never been told no in a retail establishment. Ma'am," Alexander replied. His voice was a low rumble. "I'm going to make this simple," she said, marching up to him. She didn't look at his house, his garden, or his dog. She looked at him with a mixture of disgust and absolute entitlement. "You've ignored our notices. You've ignored the fines. The outstanding balance on your property has reached unacceptable levels." Alexander tossed the rag onto the workbench. "I don't live in your subdivision. I don't owe you a dime." "You live right in the middle of our subdivision," Barbara corrected him, her lip curling. "You use our roads to get to the highway. Your overgrown trees dump leaves onto our sidewalks. You are a blight on this community, and the board has decided we are no longer going to tolerate it." She thrust the manila folder toward him. Alexander didn't take it. He let it hang in the air between them. Barbara dropped it onto the hood of his truck. "We've done an assessment," Barbara said, crossing her arms. "The HOA has retroactively applied the standard community dues, fines, and landscaping penalties to your parcel from the date Oak Ridge Estates was incorporated. Furthermore, we are assessing a mandatory integration fee to bring your property up to community standards." Alexander looked at the folder, then at her. "An integration fee? To tear down that shed, repaint the house, and remove those vehicles," she said flatly. "The total comes to $1 million. Alexander let out a slow, dry chuckle. It wasn't a sound of amusement. It was the sound of a man recognizing sheer, unadulterated madness. "You're out of your mind." Barbara's posture stiffened. She leaned in closer, dropping her voice to a harsh whisper. "Here is the reality, Alexander. You don't belong here. Look around you. Look at the homes. Look at the people. You are a relic holding on to a piece of dirt you can't afford to maintain. We have lawyers. We have a war chest. You have $1 million to pay by the 1st of next month. And if I don't? We place a lien on this property for the unpaid assessments." Barbara smiled. It was a cold, practiced expression. "And then we foreclose. We take the land. We bulldoze this shack and we build a community park. I'm offering you a choice. Pay the $1 million or leave. If you leave quietly, we might even give you a small relocation stipend." Alexander stood up. He wasn't a tall man, but he had a dense, solid build earned from a lifetime of manual labor. When he stood up straight, he seemed to block out the sun. Barbara took a half step back, her confidence flickering for a fraction of a second before her mask slammed back into place. "Get off my property," Alexander said quietly. "You have until the 1st, Barbara snapped, turning on her heel. She marched back to her SUV, got in, and slammed the door. She reversed out of the gravel driveway far too fast, bottoming out her suspension on the dip where his driveway met the road. Alexander watched her drive away. He walked over to the hood of his truck and picked up the folder. Inside was a professionally bound document. 40 pages of legal jargon, citations of state property codes, and an itemized list of absurd fines. Failure to edge lawn, $500. Displaying non-standard exterior lighting, $1,200. Maintaining a gravel driveway, $5,000. It was a bluff, mostly. Alexander knew enough about the law to know an HOA couldn't unilaterally annex a private property and enforce retroactive rules. But he also knew that the American legal system was a machine fueled by money. If Barbara filed a fraudulent lien, Alexander would have to hire a lawyer to fight it. If she kept tying him up in court, the legal fees would drain his fixed retirement income. She was trying to bleed him out. She was trying to scare him into folding. Alexander walked into his house. He went past the kitchen and down the narrow hallway to his small study. He didn't panic. Panic was for people who didn't know where they stood. Alexander knew exactly where he stood. He had stood on this dirt for nearly 60 years. He opened the bottom drawer of his heavy oak desk and pulled out a battered, fireproof metal lockbox. The key was on a chain around his neck. He unlocked it. The lid opened with a metallic squeak, releasing the smell of old paper and dust. Inside were the bones of his life, his marriage license, his wife's death certificate, his military discharge papers, and at the very bottom, in a thick plastic sleeve, the original 1968 property deed and the heavy-duty vellum plat maps from when his father had surveyed the land. He carried the maps to the dining room table and smoothed them out. He turned on the overhead light and grabbed a magnifying glass. Alexander traced the boundaries of his father's land. 5.2 acres, a perfect rectangle, save for a small, jagged edge near the southeastern corner where a creek used to run. He then pulled out the newer, glossy map, the one the Suncrest Homes lawyer had left behind 5 years ago, during their final, failed attempt to buy him out. It showed the master plan of Oak Ridge Estates. Alexander laid the new map over the old one. He didn't have architectural software. He had his eyes, a ruler, and a sharp pencil. He lined up the county road marker at the north end. He lined up the old property pins. He stared at the southeastern corner. He frowned. He adjusted his glasses, gripped the magnifying glass tighter, and leaned in until his nose was almost touching the paper. He traced the old property line. Then he traced the new subdivision's property line. They didn't match. Suncrest Homes hadn't just built around him. Alexander sat back in his chair. The silence in the house was absolute. A slow, dangerous smile crept across his face. Barbara wanted $1 million. She wanted his land. Alexander picked up the phone. He needed to make a trip to the county courthouse. The Harrison County Records Office smelled like floor wax and old secrets. It was housed in the basement of a brutalist concrete building downtown, far away from the manicured lawns of Oak Ridge. The fluorescent lights hummed with a persistent, headache-inducing buzz. Alexander walked up to the counter, Behind a pane of smudged plexiglass sat Dave. Dave was a man who looked like he had been born wearing a short-sleeved button-down shirt and a cheap tie. He had a styrofoam cup of coffee in one hand and a half-eaten, powdered donut in the other. "Morning, Art," Dave said, taking a bite of the donut. Powdered sugar drifted onto his keyboard. "Haven't seen you down here since you contested that property tax hike in 19. "Morning, Dave. Need to pull some plats. Suncrest Homes Development out on Highway 9. The Oak Ridge Estates tract." Dave groaned. "That nightmare. You know they filed over 60 amendments to their master plan when they were building that monstrosity. Kept shifting lot lines by inches to squeeze in more houses. What are you looking for?" "I need the final stamp survey they submitted to the county," Alexander said. "And I need the historical overlay based on the 1982 county topographical map." Dave wiped his hands on a paper towel and started typing. The keys clacked loudly in the quiet room. "Give me a minute. The files for Oak Ridge are thick." Alexander waited. He was patient. He watched the dust motes dance in the fluorescent light. 10 minutes later, Dave emerged from the back archives, pushing a rusty metal cart. It was loaded with 3 massive leather-bound ledger books and 2 large cardboard tubes. "All right," Dave said, unrolling a massive sheet of paper across the long wooden viewing table. He placed heavy brass paperweights on the corners. "Here's the final as-built survey filed by Suncrest 5 years ago, accepted and stamped by the county surveyor." Alexander stepped up to the table. He pulled a pair of reading glasses from his shirt pocket. "Now," Alexander said softly, "pull up my old deed, parcel 402. Dave tapped his computer mouse. A scanned image of Alexander's handwritten 1968 deed appeared on the screen, along with the digitized plot lines. Dave hit a few keys and the computer projected Alexander's property boundaries in a bright, neon green overlay directly onto the digital version of the Oak Ridge master map on the secondary monitor. "See anything interesting, Dave?" Alexander asked, his eyes locked on the screen. Dave leaned forward. He squinted. He took off his glasses and wiped them on his tie. He put them back on and leaned closer. "Well, I'll be damned," Dave whispered. "Tell me what you see," Alexander said, though he already knew. "Art, look at this boundary line here." Dave pointed a stubby finger at the southeastern quadrant of the map. "Your father's land extends down into this hook shape, but Suncrest's map drew a straight line," Alexander finished. "They cut off the hook." "They didn't just cut it off on paper," Dave said, his voice rising in disbelief. He started referencing the architectural markers on the Oak Ridge blueprint. "Look what they built on it." Alexander looked. When Suncrest Homes realized Alexander wasn't going to sell, they had to redesign their entire community layout on the fly. They were greedy. They didn't want to lose the premium lots they had planned for the center of the development. So, they squeezed everything eastward. The surveyor they hired must have been rushed, incompetent, or bribed, probably all 3. They had assumed the jagged, overgrown creek bed at the back of Alexander's property was county land, or they simply didn't care to measure accurately through the dense brush. They drew a straight line where a jagged one belonged, shaving off exactly 1.4 acres of Alexander's legally owned property. "Right here," Dave muttered, tapping the blueprint. "This is Oak Ridge Boulevard, the main thoroughfare." "Yep," Alexander said. "And this structure here." Dave swallowed hard. "Art, that's their clubhouse, and the community pool." "The deep end of the pool," Alexander noted calmly, "looks to be right about where my dad used to have a hunting blind." Dave looked at Alexander, his eyes wide. "Art, do you understand what this means? Suncrest Homes built the HOA's central infrastructure on your land. They trespassed, and when they handed the development over to the HOA board 3 years ago, the HOA inherited the trespass," Alexander said. "They don't own the clubhouse, they don't own the pool, and a 50-foot stretch of their main road is sitting on private property." Dave ran a hand over his thinning hair. "Art, you own the HOA." Alexander didn't smile. He just stared at the map. Barbara's words from the day before echoed in his mind. "We take the land. We bulldoze this shack, and we build a community park." "There's one more thing," Alexander said. Check the access easement for that road. Suncrest tried to tell me once they had an old logging easement to cross my land. Dave typed furiously. He pulled up an old digital file. Ah, yes, there was an easement granted in 1972 to a timber company. But... wait. He chuckled, a dry, raspy sound. It was a temporary use easement. It explicitly expired in the year 2000. It's completely invalid. Suncrest must have seen easement on the title search and assumed it was permanent right-of-way without reading the fine print. The trap was perfect. It wasn't just a boundary dispute. It was a catastrophic, multi-million-dollar failure in due diligence by the developer, passed directly onto an arrogant HOA board that was currently trying to extort him. I need certified copies of all of this, Dave, Alexander said, stamped, sealed, and dated. You're going to sue them, aren't you? Dave asked, already moving to the heavy-duty plotter printer in the corner. No, Alexander said. He carefully folded his reading glasses and put them back in his pocket. Suing them gives them a chance to drag it out in court. They sent me a bill for $1 million and told me to get off my land. I'm just going to return the favor. Alexander left the courthouse an hour later, carrying a heavy cardboard tube filled with certified documents. The heat outside was still oppressive, but Alexander didn't feel it. He felt lighter than he had in years. He got into his rusted Ford truck. He didn't start the engine right away. He pulled out a flip phone from the center console and dialed a number he hadn't called in 5 years. It rang 3 times. Thomas Law Firm, a sharp voice answered. Martin, Alexander said. It's Alexander Remington. There was a pause on the line. Martin Thomas was a real estate attorney. He was known in the county as a shark, a man who enjoyed dismantling corporate entities for sport. He was the one who had advised Alexander to hold his ground when Suncrest first came knocking. Alexander, it's been a while. Did you finally decide to sell? Martin asked. No, Alexander said. I decided to become a landlord, and I need to serve an eviction notice. Who are we evicting? Martin sounded intrigued. Alexander looked through his windshield at the distant beige rooftops of Oak Ridge Estates peeking over the tree line. Everybody, Alexander said. Martin Thomas did not have an office in a gleaming glass high-rise. He worked out of a renovated brick firehouse on the wrong side of the train tracks. The floors were scuffed hardwood, the air smelled of stale coffee and old paper, and his desk was a chaotic mountain of case files. Martin was in his late 50s, a man with a graying beard and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Alexander unrolled the county plats across the single, clear space on Martin's desk. He placed the certified survey and the expired easement documentation beside them. Martin leaned over the paper. He didn't say a word for 10 solid minutes. He traced the lines with the cap of a chewed-up ballpoint pen, his lips moving silently as he cross-referenced Alexander's old deed with the developer's filings. Finally, Martin tossed the pen onto the desk and let out a low whistle. He looked up at Alexander. A grin spread across his face, sharp and entirely predatory. Alexander, Martin said, his voice dropping an octave. They didn't just clip your hedges. They built the crown jewels of their little fiefdom on your front lawn. That's how I read it, Alexander said, settling into a worn leather armchair. Barbara Carmichael sent me a bill for $1 million yesterday. Said she's going to bulldoze my house and build a park. Martin laughed. It was a harsh, scraping sound. She's going to have a very hard time doing that when you own her clubhouse. The sheer, staggering incompetence of Suncrest's legal team is beautiful. They filed the wrong plats, rushed the municipal handover, and the HOA assumed liability for the trespass when they took the deed to the common areas. I don't want a long, drawn-out lawsuit, Martin. I don't have the years or the patience to sit in depositions while they file endless motions to delay. We aren't going to sue them, Martin said, opening a laptop. Suing implies we want money for damages. We don't want damages. We want our property back. This is an ejectment action, combined with an immediate cease and desist regarding the trespass. Legally speaking, they are squatters. Well-dressed squatters, but squatters nonetheless. Martin began typing. The clatter of the keyboard filled the room. We give them standard notice, Martin continued, his eyes locked on the screen. 30 days to vacate the premises, which in this case means abandoning the clubhouse, draining the pool, and ripping up the section of Oak Ridge Boulevard that crosses your land. If they don't, you have the legal right to secure your property. Secure it, Alexander repeated. Fences, Alexander. Locks, gates. It's your land. You have an absolute right to control access to it. I'll file the ejectment action with the county clerk tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. to make it official and lock in the timeline. But tonight we serve the board. The Oak Ridge Estates HOA held its monthly meetings in the community clubhouse on the first Thursday of every month. The room smelled of chlorine from the adjacent pool and cheap Pinot Grigio from the refreshment table. Barbara Carmichael stood at the podium, gripping the edges so tightly her knuckles were white. The room was packed with about 50 residents sitting in folding chairs, listening to her deliver the treasurer's report with the grim intensity of a wartime general. Richard, the perpetually anxious vice president, sat next to her, staring at his shoes. And finally, regarding the property at the center of the development, Barbara announced, her voice echoing slightly off the high, vaulted ceilings. She didn't use Alexander's name. It robbed him of his humanity, making him an abstract problem to be solved. I am pleased to announce that formal integration penalties have been levied. The squatter has been given until the first of the month to remit $1 million, or we will commence foreclosure and seizure of the parcel. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. These were people who had paid $500,000 for the illusion of control and uniformity. Alexander was a crack in their plaster. They wanted him gone. Once the land is secured, Barbara continued, smiling now, we will begin drafting plans for the Oak Ridge Centennial Park. It will feature a gazebo, a butterfly garden, and... The heavy double doors at the back of the clubhouse swung open. A man walked in. He wasn't a resident. He wore a faded blue windbreaker, jeans, and heavy work boots. He held a thick, sealed envelope in his right hand. Barbara stopped talking. She glared at the intruder. Excuse me. This is a private meeting for residents of Oak Ridge Estates only. You need to leave. The man ignored her. He walked straight down the center aisle. The residents parted slightly, watching him with a mixture of confusion and irritation. He stopped directly in front of the podium. Barbara Carmichael, the man asked. His tone was utterly bored. Yes, but I told you. President of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. Yes, Barbara snapped. Who are you? The man slapped the thick envelope onto the podium, right on top of her meticulously color-coded agenda. You've been served, the man said. He turned around and walked out exactly as he had come in, the double doors shutting behind him with a heavy thud. The room was completely silent. Everyone was staring at the envelope. Barbara let out a short, dismissive laugh. Weak, yeah. Probably just a desperate filing from the squatter. He's trying to scare us. She picked up the envelope and tore it open. She wanted to read it out loud. She wanted to humiliate Alexander in front of the entire neighborhood. She pulled out the stack of papers. The cover sheet bore the heavy, intimidating letterhead of the Thomas Law Firm. Barbara began to read. Her smile vanished. The color drained from her face, starting at her neck and rushing upward, leaving her looking like a wax statue under the harsh overhead lights. Her eyes darted back and forth across the page. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Barbara, Richard asked softly, leaning toward her. What is it? Barbara didn't answer. She flipped to the second page. It was a copy of the county surveyor's map, the bright red lines of Alexander's true property boundaries slashing straight through the middle of the very room they were sitting in. Sethexum, immediate cessation of all trespassing activities. You are hereby ordered to vacate the premises located at... She dropped the papers. They scattered across the floor of the podium. Meeting adjourned, Barbara whispered. What? Someone in the front row asked. Barbara, what does it say? I said the meeting is adjourned, Barbara shrieked, her voice cracking in a way no one had ever heard before. She scrambled to pick up the papers, clutching them to her chest as if they were radioactive. She practically ran off the stage and out the side door, leaving the residents of Oak Ridge Estates sitting in bewildered silence. Barbara spent the night frantically calling the HOA's retained legal counsel. When she finally got him on the phone at 7 a.m. the next morning, she emailed him scanned copies of the documents. She paced her spotless kitchen, biting a thumbnail down to the quick. 10 minutes later, the lawyer called back. "Well," Barbara demanded, "it's a forgery, right? He mocked up some fake maps to try and scare us off the lien." There was a heavy sigh on the other end of the line. "Barbara, did you look at the stamps on the plats? The certification seals from the county clerk?" "Yes, but anyone can buy a stamp." "Barbara, stop," the lawyer said. His voice was grim. "I just pulled the county GIS data online. I checked the filings. The documents are real. Suncrest Homes screwed up the master survey 5 years ago. This isn't a bluff." Alexander Remington owns the land under the clubhouse. He owns the pool, and he owns 50 feet of Oak Ridge Boulevard. Barbara gripped the granite countertop. The kitchen suddenly felt like it was spinning. "That's impossible. We have a deed to the clubhouse." "You have a deed to a building that was illegally constructed on someone else's land," the lawyer corrected her. "In property law, the dirt always wins. And his deed predates yours by half a century. You have zero claim to that dirt. So what do we do?" Barbara's voice trembled. "We try to negotiate an easement. We buy the land from him. But given that you just tried to extort him for $1 million, I'd say your negotiating position is severely compromised." A loud, rhythmic, mechanical, thudding sound echoed through the kitchen window. Barbara frowned. It sounded like heavy machinery. She walked to the window, pushed aside the pristine white curtains, and looked out. Her house was situated on a small hill that overlooked the Central Park area and the clubhouse. Her breath caught in her throat. Down on Oak Ridge Boulevard, right where the road curved past the clubhouse, a massive yellow Bobcat tractor was parked in the middle of the street. 3 men in high-visibility vests were operating a hydraulic post-hole digger. Crunch, grind, thud. They were drilling directly into the pristine asphalt of the neighborhood's main artery. Barbara dropped her phone. She ran out the front door, sprinted to her golf cart, and floored the accelerator. The electric motor whined in protest as she careened down the hill. And when she arrived, the reality of the situation hit her like a physical blow. Alexander Remington was standing by the side of the road, holding a thermos of coffee. He was watching calmly as the workmen sank heavy, galvanized steel fence posts into the newly drilled holes in the street. A flatbed truck was parked nearby, loaded with massive rolls of heavy-duty chain-link fencing. They had already outlined a boundary that cut perfectly across the road, effectively severing the neighborhood in half, and continued across the manicured grass, looping entirely around the clubhouse and the pool area. "Stop!" Barbara screamed, leaping out of the golf cart before it had completely stopped. "Stop this immediately. You are destroying community property." The workmen ignored her. One of them, a burly guy with a thick beard, casually checked a level against the steel post and poured quick-setting concrete into the hole. Alexander took a sip of his coffee. He looked at Barbara. "Morning, Barbara." "Are you insane?" Barbara yelled, marching up to him. "You are blocking a public road. I am calling the police. I will have you arrested for vandalism." "It's not a public road," Alexander said quietly. "Oak Ridge Boulevard is a private street maintained by the HOA. That means it's private property. Specifically, this 50-foot stretch is my private property. I'm just putting up a fence to keep trespassers off my land." Barbara pulled out her phone, her hands shaking violently. She dialed 911. "Yes, I need an officer at the Oak Ridge Clubhouse immediately. We have a deranged man destroying the road and blocking traffic." Within minutes, a county sheriff's cruiser pulled up, its lights flashing. Officer Davis, a young guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, stepped out. He took one look at the heavy machinery, the half-built fence, the screaming woman in the tennis skirt, and the calm, older man drinking coffee. "All right, folks, what seems to be the problem here?" Officer Davis asked, hooking his thumbs into his duty belt. "Arrest him." Barbara pointed a manicured finger at Alexander. "He is destroying the street. He's barricading the community center." Officer Davis looked at Alexander. "Sir, you can't drill holes in a road." Alexander didn't argue. He reached into the cab of his truck, pulled out a thick manila folder, and handed it to the officer. "I'm securing the perimeter of my legally deeded property, officer," Alexander said calmly. "Here is the certified county survey, the stamped deed, and the ejectment action filed with the county clerk at 8 o'clock this morning." As you can see, the property line begins exactly where those men are dropping the posts. Officer Davis opened the folder. He read the cover sheet. He looked at the map. He looked at the posts and the ground, tracing the invisible line with his eyes. It matched perfectly. The officer closed the folder and handed it back to Alexander. He turned to Barbara. "Ma'am, this road is on his land." "That's a lie!" Barbara shrieked. "We own that road." "The county records say otherwise," Officer Davis said, his tone shifting from authoritative to sympathetic, but firm. "This is a civil matter. It's a property line dispute. I can't arrest a man for putting up a fence on his own dirt. You need to take this up in civil court. You can't let him block the road. People need to get to work." "They can use the rear exit," Alexander interjected smoothly. Oak Ridge Estates had a secondary access point, an unpaved, rutted dirt road at the far back of the subdivision, meant only for emergency vehicles and construction crews. It added 4 miles to the commute and ruined car suspensions. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Officer Davis said, stepping back toward his cruiser. "And if he owns the land, he can fence it. Have a good day." The cruiser pulled away. Barbara stood in the street, utterly paralyzed. Behind her, a line of cars was beginning to form. Commuters in BMWs and Lexuses, holding travel mugs, honked their horns, leaning out of their windows to see why the road was blocked. They saw the chain-link fence going up across their perfect street. They saw the locks being placed on the heavy iron gates of the clubhouse. They saw the "no trespassing" private property signs being zip-tied to the metal mesh. Alexander finished his coffee. He screwed the lid onto the thermos. He looked at Barbara, who was staring at the fence with wide, vacant eyes, her empire crumbling into dust right in front of her. "I believe you owe me $1 million by the 1st of the month, Barbara," Alexander said. His voice carried no anger, just the heavy, immovable weight of reality. "Or you can leave." Alexander turned his back on her and walked back to his house. The sound of the post-hole digger chewing through the asphalt echoed loudly across the beige sea. By day 3, Oak Ridge Estates was completely unspooling. The chain-link fence stood 8 feet tall. It didn't just block Oak Ridge Boulevard. It cut a ruthless, diagonal slice through the manicured heart of the subdivision. Commuters trying to leave for work in the morning hit the barricade, cursed, and were forced to reverse a half-mile back up the hill. They had to use the emergency exit. It was an unpaved, deeply rutted logging trail meant for fire trucks, not low-clearance luxury sedans. The dry August heat turned the dirt into fine, chalky dust that coated black Mercedes and white Teslas in a thick, grimy film. When it rained on Thursday night, the dust turned to thick, red Georgia clay. Tires spun out. Suspensions bottomed out with sickening metallic crunches. One resident tore the oil pan clean off his brand-new BMW on a submerged rock. By Friday morning, a local towing company had a flatbed permanently stationed at the bottom of the trail, making a fortune. The residents were furious, but their anger, initially aimed at Alexander, quickly pivoted. Alexander wasn't fining them for having the wrong color mailbox. Alexander hadn't sent them $1 million extortion letter. Barbara had. The community pool, enclosed behind Alexander's fence, was the next casualty. August in Georgia is unforgiving. Without the daily chemical treatments from the neighborhood maintenance crew, who were now legally barred from stepping onto the property, the pristine blue water turned a swampy, opaque green. Algae bloomed along the expensive waterline tiles. A family of ducks moved in. Alexander sat on his porch every evening. He drank sweet tea. He watched the ducks. Barbara's phone never stopped ringing. The HOA board members, once her terrified disciples, were in open revolt. Richard, the anxious vice president, knocked on her door on Saturday morning. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. "Barbara, my wife can't get her minivan out of the neighborhood without bottoming out," Richard said, standing on her pristine welcome mat. "Suncrest Homes' corporate office isn't returning my calls. The landscapers quit because as they can't access the central storage shed, we have to make a deal with him." "We are not negotiating with a terrorist, Richard," Barbara hissed, clutching a mug of coffee like a weapon. "He is holding our property hostage." "It's not our property," Richard yelled. It was the first time in 5 years he had raised his voice. "The county confirmed it. Suncrest confirmed it. We built our clubhouse on his lawn. He has every right to fence it off. The whole neighborhood is talking, Barbara. They want you out. They're circulating a petition to dissolve the board." Barbara slammed the door in his face. She leaned against the heavy wood, her chest heaving. The pristine, beige world she had meticulously curated was collapsing. On Monday morning, the heavy hitters arrived. 3 black SUVs pulled up to the chain-link barricade. Men in very expensive suits got out. They weren't from the local HOA. They were the regional legal team for Suncrest Homes. They had finally realized the magnitude of the catastrophic liability they had dumped onto Oak Ridge Estates. If Alexander decided to sue the developer for illegal land seizure and construction, the settlement would dwarf the value of the entire subdivision. Alexander was waiting for them at the fence. Martin Thomas stood next to him, wearing a wrinkled linen suit and a predatory grin. "Mr. Remington," the lead lawyer said through the chain link. He was young, slick, and sweating heavily in the heat. "I'm David Vance, counsel for Suncrest Homes. We'd like to sit down and discuss a mutually beneficial resolution to this mapping error." "It wasn't a mapping error," Martin interjected smoothly. "You annexed an acre and a half of prime real estate to squeeze in 6 more residential lots on the north side, assuming my client would die or go away. It's theft, grand theft real estate." David wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. "We are prepared to offer substantial compensation for the parcel, far above market value. We can cut a check today, remove the fence, and put this behind us." "You don't understand," Alexander said, stepping closer to the fence. His voice was low, carrying effortlessly over the low hum of the idling SUVs. "I don't want your money. I don't want to sell. I told your people that 5 years ago." "Mr. Remington, be reasonable. You have a clubhouse on your property. You can't maintain it. It's a liability." "I'm going to turn it into a greenhouse," Alexander said simply. "The pool will make a nice aquaponics setup for tilapia." The lawyer stared at him horrified. He realized Alexander wasn't bluffing. Alexander didn't care about money. He cared about his dirt. He cared about peace, and they had taken his peace. "What do you want?" David asked, his slick corporate veneer cracking. Alexander looked at Martin. Martin nodded. "We want a meeting," Martin said. "Tomorrow at noon, right here at the gate. I want you, the developer, and I want Barbara Carmichael and the entire HOA board. Bring your checkbooks. Bring your notary." Tuesday at noon was blistering hot. The sun beat down on the cracked asphalt of Oak Ridge Boulevard. Alexander brought 2 folding lawn chairs and set them up on his side of the fence. He and Martin sat down. On the other side stood a miserable congregation. David, the Suncrest lawyer, flanked by 2 junior partners. Barbara Carmichael, wearing large sunglasses, her arms crossed defensively. Cusp Richard, sweating profusely, and about 30 neighborhood residents who had walked down the hill to witness the execution. Martin unlatched a heavy padlock and swung a small pedestrian gate open. He walked through, holding a leather briefcase. He didn't offer anyone a chair. "Here is the reality of the situation," Martin announced to the crowd. He didn't sound like a lawyer giving a deposition. He sounded like a judge handing down a sentence. Suncrest Homes committed a massive negligent trespass. The Oak Ridge Estates HOA assumed liability for that trespass and subsequently attempted to extort my client for $1 million under threat of illegal foreclosure. Barbara flinched. The neighbors glared at her. "My client has zero legal obligation to sell you this land," Martin continued. "He can tear down that clubhouse tomorrow. He can leave this fence up permanently. He can make you drive through the mud for the rest of your lives." Dead silence hung over the crowd. A woman in the back silently wept for the suspension on her Audi. "However," Martin said, his voice echoing off the brick facade of the locked clubhouse, "Alexander is a reasonable man. He just wants to grow his tomatoes, so he is offering a lease." David, the Suncrest lawyer, blinked. "A lease?" "A 99-year irrevocable ground lease." Martin pulled a thick stack of papers from his briefcase. "Alexander retains total ownership of the land, but he will lease the parcel containing the clubhouse, the pool, and the road back to the Oak Ridge HOA. "For how much?" Richard asked nervously. For the exact amount you demanded from him. Alexander spoke up from his lawn chair. He didn't shout, but everyone heard him. $1 million. Paid in full today. The HOA doesn't have $1 million, Barbara shrieked, losing her composure. Our reserve fund barely covers roof repairs. I know, Alexander said. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at the men in the expensive suits. They do. Every head swiveled to David. The lawyer swallowed hard. Suncrest Homes created this liability, Martin said, turning to the corporate suits. You defrauded the HOA when you handed over the common areas. If Alexander doesn't lease the land to the HOA will sue Suncrest into the ground for the master plan failure. If Alexander tears down the road, every homeowner here will sue Suncrest for diminished property value. You are writing a check for $1 million to the Oak Ridge Estates HOA, and the HOA is going to sign it directly over to Alexander. David opened his mouth to argue, calculated the cost of 50 simultaneous homeowner lawsuits, plus a massive civil suit from Alexander, and closed it. He pulled out a phone and walked away to make a very difficult call to his CEO. There's more, Alexander said, standing up. He walked to the gate. He looked directly at Barbara. The lease has stipulations, Martin read from the contract. First, Alexander Remington's property is entirely, permanently, and irrevocably severed from any and all HOA jurisdiction. No covenants, no bylaws, no fines, no letters. Second, a solid brick wall, 8 feet high, will be constructed at Suncrest's expense along Alexander's true property line, separating his land from your road and clubhouse, with mature trees planted on your side so he doesn't have to look at you. Fine, Richard said immediately. We'll sign it, whatever it takes. Third, Alexander said. His voice was heavy, absolute. Barbara looked at him. She knew what was coming. The entire neighborhood knew what was coming. Barbara Carmichael resigns from the board, Alexander said, today, and she is barred from holding any position of authority in this neighborhood for the duration of her residency. Barbara's mouth dropped open. She looked around at her neighbors, expecting someone, anyone, to jump to her defense. To say this was an outrage, to protect her. The neighbors stared back with cold, unforgiving eyes. Do it, Barbara, a man in a golf shirt growled from the back, or we'll run you out of here ourselves. Barbara's shoulders collapsed. The clipboard dictator was dead. The queen of the Beige Empire had been dethroned by a man with grease on his hands and a deed from 1968. Without a word, Barbara turned around. She pushed her way through the crowd, walking back up the hill toward her pristine, empty house. She listed it for sale 3 days later. By Friday, the money was in Alexander's bank account. A wire transfer from Suncrest Homes, routed through the HOA, settling a debt they never should have owed, for a fine Alexander never should have received. The chain-link fence came down. The brick masons arrived the following week. Alexander didn't buy a new truck. He didn't buy a fancy suit. He took $1,000 out in cash, went down to the local hardware store, and bought the best commercial gray rototiller money could buy. A month later, the brick wall was finished. It was tall, solid, and quiet. Alexander couldn't see the beige houses anymore. He couldn't hear the golf carts. He just had his trees, his dirt, and the heavy, sweet silence of a battle won. He knelt in the soil, working a new row of seeds into the ground. Buster, his old golden retriever, lay in the shade of the oak tree, thumping his tail lazily against the grass. Alexander looked at his hands, dark with earth. He smiled. He belonged to the land, and the land, indisputably and forever, belonged to him. What a story, right? There is nothing quite as satisfying as watching a neighborhood tyrant get absolutely flattened by the sheer weight of their own arrogance. Alexander proved that you don't need a loud voice or a flashy suit to win. You just need the truth, a good deed, and an iron will. If you loved watching Barbara's HOA empire crumble to dust as much as we did, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories of everyday people fighting back and winning. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if you were Alexander? Share this video with a friend who hates HOAs, and we'll see you in the next one.